Commission on Global Governance 1995 report, it is a summation that we are seeing on numerous approaches which is being done both by the public and the private sector. Governance ideology is to create an invisible shield which is actually going to protect the individual interest and also make people understand the importance here. Everybody loves to talk about change. Why? Because change is the most constant factor in this world. Good morning and welcome to the second session in Chapter 2, Unit 1, 4th semester Good Governance in BCom, where we are going to speak about governance and globalization. This is a quite hot topic which I would like to talk about. Why? Because today the concept of good governance is something that is paramount of importance here. Why? Because if you start looking here, it compares itself to the ineffective economies of political bodies with feasible economies and the political bodies to meet the requirements altogether. By governance, we mean the process of decision making. This is what we are involved and this is what we need to focus. By governance, it's a process of decision making that is used to implement the decisions. We need to understand the difference between government and governance every time. We are not dependent on government every time for decisions, but governance enables us to make better decisions which can be implemented in the long run. Now, going back here, Commission on Global Governance 1995 report, it is a summation that we are seeing on numerous approaches which is being done both by the public and the private sector. So governance is not a limited topic. It is not one which is only for the public institutions. It's also for the private institutions also. The aim of governance is to accommodate everybody's interests. The aim of governance is to make people understand how effective decisions can be taken, which can be mutually benefit for the society as well as for the organizations. So the concept of governance has got a very wide approach, trying to understand seemingly every aspect of the society, including the human factor. Going further, let's try to understand how it is empowering the nation to achieve its dreams. Now, the formal institutions are empowered to enforce compliance as well as the informal arrangements of people and institutions that have agreed to perceive their interests. The governance, if you start looking here, is such an important aspect which is actually empowering every organization to think out of the box. Now, governance is not just innovation. I don't mean to say that we're going to come up with fancy ideas here. What I mean by governance is that it's allowing people to think. It's allowing people to make certain crucial decisions which are important in the modern society. Now, followed by which, I would like to say this: governance serves by safeguarding the territorial integrity of the state and securing individual security in the eyes of law, the rule of law, and a wide range of services that we are talking about. So governance is actually the armor, that is the knight standing with the armor. It is the shield that's going to protect the state, the law, and the individual altogether. Governance ideology is to create an invisible shield which is actually going to protect the individual interest and also make people understand the importance here. So whenever we are going to talk about health to livelihood to food security, governance is going to be an inbuilt aspect. Followed by which, a good governance. What do you mean by good governance? There are no doubts that implementation of good governance is both in new and old democracy, and we have seen both the positive effects and the negative effects. In fact, when you start talking about the non-democratic regime altogether, the situation is different, but the impact of good governance is always felt. that is always needed, I would like to say. The concept of good governance is like a mechanism that's going to run again and again and try to bring in democracy in different levels. It's actually a process that needs to be regenerated every time to understand the consequences. So whenever we're talking about those non-democratic countries, we need to understand that governance has to be brought in there so that everybody can become a part and parcel of the decision-making process, and by which they will be able to grow better. Now, moving further, when we talk about the good governance altogether, good governance is like an instrument that helps in the global capitalism to expand more easily because of the spread of certain basic standards. And then whenever we are looking into the values of the world, so governance is actually setting in certain principles, certain values which can be followed all throughout the world, and this can stand as an example for others. And the other side, when you start looking in, it is the basic principles. Whenever you see that which are not being informally accepted, it can actually hinder the development of the society. Now, for example, if a good governance model is not set up in a state or in a district or in any of the areas that we are talking about, then automatically it becomes a hindrance, and that entire area, the entire state is falling apart. Why? Because you don't have a proper legal framework to guide and take it forward. Now, a good governance imposition has become a part of the power conflict and can destroy the value system. Now, this is very important where I want you to focus. Why? Because the aim of governance is to empower and give that liberalized mode of thinking. The aim of governance is not to create a conflict. The aim of governance is not about making one individual more powerful than the law, than the society. We're not trying to create groupism. We are not trying to create favoritism among people. What we are trying to do is enable people to think better, enable people to come up with their valued opinions that has to be regarded, that has to be understood by everybody. So what we want is that good governance is a good servant but a bad master. Sometimes we feel that governance, if it becomes too much and it has been liberalized and it's given to one person and people start taking advantage of that situation, then it becomes a bad master. In fact, although good governance contains very good features that can be potential enough to bring in drastic changes in the path of organization, the implementation of the principles have proved to be a great question. Anywhere and everywhere of this world, the question is about implementing the change. Everybody loves to talk about change. Why? Because change is the most constant factor in this world. So everybody loves to be a part of the change. Everybody wants to change. Everybody wants to say that why can't we bring in new process, new ideas, new thoughts? But then, how are you going to implement those thought process? Who is the person who's going to be held responsible, accountable for the changes that are going to come inside your society? Now, followed by which, we have certain things that are very, very important when it comes to good governance. We are talking about the principles of transparency, participation, the rule of law, responsiveness, consensus orientation, inclusion, effectiveness, and the efficiency factor. All these things are very, very important. Why? Because they perform a lot of important tasks. Now, whenever we talk about transparency, we are talking about the factor where it has to be open enough. You need to participate. There needs to be an integrity of the law factor. It has to be the responsible, and the time factor has to be maintained. Everybody's consensus has to be taken, and there needs to be an inclusion. Now, moving further, whenever we are talking about globalization, this is a key player for growth. That's what we have been talking about for a very, very long time. Now, why globalization actually matters is because it is trying to change the world for a better growth path. In 2002, the World Bank report study says that 72 developing countries since the year 1980 have tried to make their economy as globalized as possible. They have stepped out of the old school and they want to change their government. They want to change the way of thinking. So globalization is definitely the path to grow and make your organization even more stronger. Now, The next thing that we are going to see here is the globalization, how it is becoming such a key player for growth. Why? Because when you look into the studies, they have shown that the ratio of trade increase in GDP raises up by 1% completely, and the level of income also increases to 1.5–2%, which is a big ratio that we have been talking about. From the year 1960 onwards, the Asian economies have become super strong economies, export-oriented, and they have started becoming globalized by lowering the tariffs and other factors. They have provided the population with a lot of education, infrastructure, and generally they have given a sound governance. So when you start going through this entire state of affair, you would see that in the last 20 years, countries like Japan or China, Singapore, everybody has been aggregating themselves with a 5.5–6% growth plus up to 8% in terms of the GDP. This has been possible. Why? Because they have adopted good governance principle, allowed their country to go on in terms of development mode by export and import factors, and they have liberalized the trade factors. So this is where the democratic thinking of liberalizing yourself, bringing in the good governance principles will definitely matter to make your nation better. Followed by the factor of when an economy grows, the income of the poor also rises on average. So probably these nations have been able to understand by increasing the GDP, by giving that outlook, the poverty can also be reduced. Whereas on the contrary, when you look into the sub-Saharan African regions and zones, the poverty condition is still very drastic. It's very worst altogether because they have not been able to bring in that internal governance mode. They have not been able to grow themselves out of the shell. They've not been able to think further in terms of development. The barriers to products, the barriers to thinking, the barriers in terms of growing forward is actually affecting them. So this is very, very important that you start bringing in better governance standards which can make them grow further. Followed by, we are also going to talk about the factors called as globalization, where the key for the growth, as where we are talking about the UN Secretary General, former Kofi Annan, when he had talked about the main losers of today are very, very about the unequal world. Why? Because there is so much in this world to be spoken about in inequality. A lot of people do not even get a chance to be a part of the growth story. It is so unfortunate because their country is not a part of the global growth story. They have been deprived from the basic rights of education, healthcare, food, or clothing, and that's one of the reasons why you see that they have been almost homeless for more than decades. Now that's exactly where you need to think about how we can use good governance principle to bring in equality in this wonderful world. So wherever you have been seeing that the governance principles will actually help you to bring in a better structure, a better legal framework where everybody will be given a chance to participate, where everybody will be given a chance to bring out their opinions and make this world a better livable place. Followed by the Norberg, that is of the Zimbabwe, where it was undertaken, the world's fastest and most consistent retreat of alleged evils of the globalization and liberalization. Robert Mugabe, the person who was behind Zimbabwe, trade has been limited, government spending has increased, and the controls have installed, freedom of expression limited, and you would also see that the property appropriated. Consequently, within 5 years, Zimbabwe went from being an exporter of foodstuffs to a country where more than 6 million people are now facing starvation. Now look at it. A country which was once considered to be a good exporter, all of a sudden just tipped down in its economy, just came down, falling like a pack of cards. And today, if you look into the economy of Zimbabwe, they're almost in the verge of starvation. And yes, they are there. That the reason is that, again, the governance practices were not there, no transparency, no accountability. And you would probably also see that the government sector has completely gone berserk, where they're not being able to control any of the systems. So that's how, corruption and the the illegal practices can completely bring down the economy. We are not just talking about government holding, but we are also talking about the factor that how does a thinking actually lead to development or destruction in the long run. Now, coming to the conclusion for today's session, the most interesting part that I would like to talk upon is that the cross-cultural democratic patterns that we have been talking about, which the India's institutions also need to address, and that's been a concern for a very, very long term. We all know that in India, because the entire factor has been growing very, very strongly, where we are trying to come out in a different mode, in a different line altogether. We want each one of us to be known individually as a person with a remarkable identity. So now India has taken the bold step of coming up forward with a new image, with a new identity, where we have started promoting production concept, where we have started bringing in new lease of life to services, and we are building up a stronger economy. So what really requires is that where we are able to support the people, provide them the basic necessity and infrastructure, and make this country a stronger governance-oriented country rather than a government-oriented country. And the most important thing that we are going to talk about is the public expenditure review, where we have to periodically see the review that how it is going up right from a village level to that of a central level. Civil services should be given clear responsibility. We should not be just carried away by the red tapeism and the bureaucratism. We should give them the opportunity to come forward, make them think liberally, and persons who are charge sheeted by a competent court for heinous offenses or corrupt practices should be completely debarred from contesting the election. So we should not give chances for corrupt people to again rule our country. With this, I come to the end of today's session. I hope and believe that all the facts and figures that have been spoken through this session would be of great use to you, both from a practical as well as from a theoretical standpoint of view. In the upcoming sessions, we are going to talk about the global governance in terms of networking and the corporate governance factors. But until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened for all. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session.